Hey everyone, it's Kenji, and we're gonna make some Ropa Vieja. So, I was actually gonna make the Colombian version of this dish, which is Carne Desmechada, which it's essentially shredded beef, so shredded braised flank steak. But I was at my local Fred Meyer, and they had 3 bell peppers on sale for $1 in like the bargain vegetable section. So I decided to go make the Cuban version instead. It's sort of the national dish of Cuba. So it's essentially shredded flank steak. A few different ways to make it. I'm going to make it this way. I can tell you about the differences between this way and other ways to make it. But we start with flank steak. Flank steak. So when you buy beef like this, by the way, you might notice sometimes one side is kind of red and the other side is kind of purplish, or sometimes if we cut into it, the inside's a little purplish. This is not like, some people will tell you, oh, this is the beef industry trying to dye their beef to trick you into making it, you think it's fresh. That's not actually the case. The color comes from myoglobin, which is a pigment in muscles. You can see, by the way, I'm cutting against the grain, so the grain on a flank steak runs lengthwise like that. You can see the fibers. I'm cutting against them into 2 or 3 inch pieces or so, and you'll see why later. But I'm going to preheat my Dutch oven on high heat. So the color on a piece of meat comes from myoglobin. It can take a few different forms. So when it lacks oxygen, so when it's inside the meat, you can see the inside of this is kind of purplish. When it lacks oxygen, it becomes deoxymyoglobin, which has that kind of purplish color. And on the outside, it's just myoglobin red. If it becomes oxidized, it can turn kind of brownish, and that's what happens when you have like hamburger meat that looks brown on the outside, or a steak that has like kind of brown spots. It's not necessarily rotten or bad. That's just a different form of myoglobin called metmyoglobin. But anyhow, what you might sometimes find is that in packaging, especially the kind of packaging where it's like a tray with a sealed cover and an airspace in between, they fill that airspace with nitrogen gas, which is a neutral gas. And what that does is it prevents the meat from oxidizing, and it keeps it bright red. So in that sense, it is sort of, dyed, so to speak, but it's not dyed in the sense that they aren't adding like red food coloring to it. They're just adding a neutral gas in there to make sure that it doesn't change color on you. All right, so in this version of this, I'm going to start by searing my steak. Many recipes for this, and I would say, I think in Colombia especially, I'm not sure in Cuba because I've never been to Cuba, but at least in Colombia, most versions of the dish that you see, they won't actually sear. You won't actually sear the meat first. You would simply braise it, boil it. I'm gonna sear it just because I want that added seared flavor. But you don't have to. You absolutely don't have to at all. All right. So we heat up the oil till it's shimmering in a big heavy Dutch oven like this, and then I'm gonna put my meat down, a single layer, letting that brown nicely while I prepare the rest of my ingredients. Okay, so for our other ingredients, we're gonna have some bell peppers. I'm only using 2 orange and 1 green because, as I said, these came in one little pack on sale. You can use a mix of green and red. You can use all green. You can use all red, all orange. The main flavor difference between orange and red, there's not gonna be much. Green is gonna be less sweet because it's not as ripe as orange and red bell peppers. So I don't know, usually I like to do a mix of red and green, or green and some other color. You can leave out the peppers entirely though. Now this is also, by the way, the easiest way I know to prep peppers with a knife. Hold it upright and then kind of cut around like that. Top to bottom. Try and take out the white ribs as much as possible, but you can go in and trim them off later as well. And you end up with just the seeds coming straight out like that. All right. So what we'll do now is I'll just trim out a couple of these extra ribs. And that's it. You don't have to use bell peppers either if you want something with a little more like heat, although this dish is not traditionally spicy. If you want something a little more heat, you could use something like a poblano or an Anaheim. I think it would still be delicious. Anyhow, the Colombian version is made just with shredded beef, onions, tomato, a sauce called ogao, an onion and tomato sauce, whereas the Cuban version typically has peppers and olives added to it. Okay, so we're cutting into strips lengthwise here. some people, when they cut their peppers, you know, people actually ask me, should you hold your pepper with the skin side up or down? If I have a very sharp knife, which you know you should, I generally go skin side down. If I have a slightly duller knife, sometimes it's hard to get through that skin, so I turn it this way so that you can apply a little bit more pressure without and pop through that skin instead of relying just on the sharpness of your knife. But if you've got a sharp knife, I would go skin side down. That way you don't crush the peppers as much. Okay, where did my tongs go? I'm not too worried about like browning this the way I would brown, say, you know, a steak. I don't care that it's going to be perfectly browned. I just want it to be reasonably well browned. Oops, did I got some grease on my camera lens here. Turn on the fan. All right. Onions and peppers. Now our onion. We're going to be cutting this one pole to pole into slivers, so cut the top off, cut the bottom off. Peel off that outer layer. And compost. Now, it doesn't have to be super thin. We're going for maybe like 1/4 to 1/5 of an inch slices. You know, so maybe 1/2 to 2/3 of a centimeter, I think, is about what you're aiming for. Maybe 1/2 centimeter. All right, so onions, peppers. Brown that second side of the beef here. And garlic. Cut the ends off. This dish, you might notice some similarities to, you know, Jewish-style braised brisket, and I think, and someone correct me if I'm wrong on the history, but I believe that this Ropa Vieja was brought to the Americas based on a Jewish Spanish dish. And it was cooked, you know, braised dishes like this are often cooked for Shabbat, so they would be cooked the day before the day of rest, and then that way you don't have to turn on the oven or anything the next day, and you can just enjoy this nice braised meat as it is. But I'm no scholar on this, so don't quote me on that. But the end result, though, is that you end up with a dish that is sort of custom designed to taste better the next day. Or at least just as good the next day. You know, the idea that a stew tastes better the second day, I tried to do a bunch of testing on this, not with this particular dish, but with a more sort of classic beef stew. What I found was that it's generally not true. If you make two of them side by side, you know, one day and one the next day, and then feed them side by side to people, most people can't really tell the difference. The main difference, I think, comes down to the fact that on the day you're making it, you're smelling it cooking the whole day. And so it's kind of like you become desensitized to it, to the smells of it. So then when you reheat it the next day, it's like a fresh smell, and you're like, oh, it smells much stronger than it did yesterday. And so people tend to think that food, like stewed foods, taste better the second day. The things that do actually taste different the second day are that spicy foods and vinegary foods can actually taste a little bit milder the second day. That's what I found in my testing. So if a dish tastes kind of like sharp, letting it mellow out for a day can improve it. But otherwise, there's not too much to that idea that things actually taste better the next day, other than mentally. I mean, of course, mentally is an important thing. So, all right. Onions and peppers. I'm gonna give them some salt to pull out some moisture and help them soften a little better. Notice I didn't season my beef at the beginning. I could have seasoned it a little bit, but I didn't want to, just because generally with braised dishes, things that are going to cook for a long time or reduce, I try to minimize the amount of salt I add during cooking. You know, you want a little bit in there so that at least there's some sort of seasoning that's making its way into the meat, but you want to minimize the amount of salt just because it's very easy to over season things that are going to end up reducing, and that's not what you want to have happen here. Alright. Are we still greasy up here? Yeah, a little bit, huh? I guess that's a good visual for why kitchen surfaces tend to get greasy as you cook, and why you need to clean out your vent hood every once in a while. Alright, so this garlic, I'm just gonna give it a rough chop. I'm not even gonna bother really mincing it or anything. I'm just gonna kind of slice it. Give it a slight smash while I was peeling it, and then I'll slice it like that. A very rough chop. For a long cooked dish like this, I don't mind having kind of bigger bits of garlic in there. Alright, now for our spices, we're doing a mix of oregano and cumin, so maybe a tablespoon of each. That was about 1.5 pounds of meat, by the way. Maybe 2 pounds. This will feed about 4 people. And then I'm just going to grind it all up. This is a Japanese style mortar and pestle. You can do this in a spice grinder, or you can use pre-ground cumin. It doesn't really matter. Whole spices tend to hold their flavor better during storage, just because there aren't as many surface areas for volatile aromatics to escape. And the reason you know they're escaping is because if you open up a jar of cumin, you can smell it. And general rule of thumb is that if you can smell something, if the food is reaching, if the aroma is reaching your nose, that means it's no longer in the food. So anything that gives off an aroma, any spices that give off an aroma, means those smells are slowly disappearing as you store them. All right, just gonna let this soften up a little bit. Not looking for much color or anything. I don't really want to get the sweetness out of the onions, or extra. The peppers are plenty sweet on their own. I don't need to brown or caramelize the onions much. We just want to get rid of that sort of raw edge on them. I'm gonna go in with my garlic. Give it about 30 seconds or so for it to get nice and aromatic. So again, the Colombian version at this point, what I would be doing, oh, you know what I'll do? I have all these, where'd they go? I have these real old cherry tomatoes that need to get used up. So the Colombian version, I would probably be using fresh tomatoes instead of canned tomatoes, although canned tomatoes you can definitely use. But you would make a sauce called ogao, which is the base of many Colombian stews and soups and stuff. And it's essentially you would saute down onions or green onions in oil, and then add some chopped seeded tomatoes, and let that all cook down slowly. Season with salt, and that's your ogao base, and that becomes the base sauce for this. Whereas the Cuban version, we're doing a mix of onions and peppers and tomatoes. But that's really the main difference between the two. Also what you serve it with. Okay. Now I got, let's do some tomato paste. So I want to finish up this tube. Let that cook for just a second. Okay. I'm going to add about 2 cups of canned tomatoes. Those are whole peeled tomatoes that I crushed between my hands. But you know, you can use crushed tomatoes. That's fine. You can use canned diced tomatoes. That's also fine. I tend to buy just whole peeled tomatoes because I find the quality to be more consistent. But if you've got crushed or diced, that's fine. Now I'm going to add some chicken stock, a couple cups. It's just homemade. You can use store-bought. You could use water. You could use bouillon. All right, season it lightly. Salt, pepper. And then at this point, I'm going to get my beef back in there and nestle it in. All the juices too. And I'm just going to let this come up to a simmer. So Ropa Vieja means old clothes, and it's called that because of the way the meat shreds like old fabric when it's done cooking. So you can do this dish entirely on the stovetop if you want. You know, just let this come up to a boil, reduce it to a simmer, cover it, and let it simmer for about, you know, until the meat is shreddable. So it'll take about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, depending on the exact cut of meat and how thick it is and all that stuff. You know, no 2 cuts of meat are exactly the same. So it could take, you could do it on the stovetop. I'm gonna do it in the oven. The reason I like to do it in the oven is because, so a stovetop is a constant heat output situation. You know, so you set the stove to a certain level, and you're getting a fixed number of BTUs per hour, thermal units per hour that are coming out, right? And so because of that, as the liquid reduces, what happens is if a full pot is at a simmer, as the liquid reduces, the same amount of heat is going to be heating up a smaller volume of food. And so what was a simmer could turn into a full boil when you do it at a stovetop. Whereas an oven, on the other hand, is a constant temperature thing. So it calculates how much fuel, and you know, has a thermostat. It calculates how much fuel it needs to burn, or at least it's triggered to burn a certain amount of fuel every time the temperature drops below a certain range. So it's not constantly burning fuel. It's only burning enough to keep it at a specific temperature. So you should be at, you know, thermal equilibrium essentially, you know, with fluctuations depending on what kind of controller your oven has. But what that means is that no matter the volume of food that you're cooking, it's all going to be at the same temperature, and it doesn't get hotter and hotter as it reduces the way it does on the stovetop. The other advantage of an oven is that it heats from the bottom and the top, and so what happens is in a Dutch oven, so you can see I'm leaving the lid slightly cracked open like this. What happens is in the Dutch oven, the top surface of this is going to dry out a little bit and actually start to brown, and so that's going to give you added flavor as well. All right, so into the oven, I'm going at 300 degrees with the lid slightly ajar, just like that. And then we just let it go, and then we'll finish it off when we come back. So I will be back in about 1 minute, because I forgot to put the cumin and oregano in there. This is what happens when you shoot with a camera on your head. You forget very basic things. So I actually ideally should have put that cumin and oregano in while I was before I put in the tomato paste, or at least while I put in the tomato paste, so it'd have a little bit of a chance to toast, but that's all right. It's still gonna taste good. All right, mix that right in there. You know, if you wanted to, you could throw some, say, thyme stems in here. That would be delicious. Some whole stems of thyme. In fact, maybe I'll do that. I know I got a little thyme out here. Just got the thyme out here. This is my thyme out here. All right. Got some thyme. You could throw some bay leaves in here if you wanted. Whatever sounds good to you. Yeah, okay. Now it tastes better with that cumin. All right. Now, into the oven it goes. And now I will see you in Couple hours. Okay, so I got caught in another meeting, so it took a little longer than expected. This was probably done 20 minutes ago, but it's pretty forgiving, so let's see where we are. Looking good. All right, let me grab a fork. And there's just a couple things we're going to check. So first we're going to pull out that spent time. Okay, now let's check the meat. What we're looking for is for it to shred really nicely, which is doing. Okay, so we'll just shred it apart with some forks. So this is sort of the ideal texture. You want the meat to be shreddable and tender, but not dry. So if you were to overcook this too far, like if I were to let this go for like another hour or so, the meat would kind of, instead of shredding apart with a little bit of a pull like that, it would just completely fall apart, and it would end up super, super dry. But right here, this is kind of ideal. Shreds with just a little bit of a pull. Kind of like how good barbecue, when it's done, it should, like a good barbecued rib, for example, when it's done, you should be able to pull it off the bone with a little tug, as opposed to have it sort of fall off the bone. That is, you know, some people like it falling off the bone, which is fine. And some people like the meat in this to be a little drier and a little shreddier, which is also fine. But for me, coming apart with a little tug like that is what we're after. Okay. The last piece here. You can see how there's all this nice browning that happened also on the top surface. That's all going to add flavor to it. So flank steak is not one of these cuts that you would think of traditionally for braising, because it's low and relatively low in connective tissue. It's relatively lean, and because it shreds like this, as opposed to turning sort of, you know, tender and fall apart the way like a chuck would, you know. But that's sort of what's unique about this particular dish, that shreddy texture. All right, the final ingredient here that differentiates the Cuban version of this from the Colombian version is the inclusion of olives. So the Cuban version has olives, green olives. These are just Castelvestrano, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Italian green olives. Not the typical choice for this, but it's what I had in the fridge, so it's what I'm using. But you could use something like, you know, a canned green olive. Green olives with pimentos are really good in this. Did you know that most of the time when you buy olives with pimentos, the pimentos aren't actual pimentos, like they aren't actual chunks of pepper. They're usually like a pepper flavored agar gel that gets cut and inserted into them. It's because it's much cheaper to make big sheets of that and cut it into strips and stick them in there with a machine than to cut actual peppers into the right size. So next time you get a pimento stuffed pepper, take out the pimento and take a look at it, and you'll see that it's not actually pimento at all. All right, a little bit of salt to finish it off. So this dish, you would, in Cuba, you would have this with rice, black beans, maybe some fried plantains. In Colombia, you would typically have it with fried plantains, rice, and then oftentimes you'd also have it with an arepa. So that's how I'm going to test it out today. I have these arepas I made the other day that I just reheated. This one's a very small one, so perfect for tasting. You can finish this off with a handful of chopped cilantro if you want, but I don't have any, so I'm not going to. All right. It's gonna be hot, I can tell. That is hot. But delicious. All right, everybody. That's it. I'm going to let this cool overnight, and we'll eat it tomorrow. I'm going to cook some black beans and some rice, fry some plantains, and we'll eat this all tomorrow. But you're not going to get to eat any of it because you're not here. All right. Guys, gals, non-binary pals. Oh, hamon. Shabu. There you go. Sit. Good girl. Good boy. All right. Guys, gals, non-binary pals. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Oh, hey, I'm back again. So I decided after I ate a little bit more of that I actually wanted the meat a little bit more tender. And then I thought to myself, I got to go pick up my kid from school. And so I let it go for actually about an hour and a half after what it was before. And then I stirred it a bit. So now this is actually a little over from where I wanted, but I think it's a good illustration of what happens between those times. So what I showed you before was a little bit on the just barely done side, where it takes a little bit of pulling to get the stuff apart. And this is on like the just past, this is like probably the most you would ever want to cook it. Any more than this, it's going to start to get really dry. But you can see how the meat here is now really, really nice and sort of ropey and shredded. So depending on how long you cook it, and again, that time can vary based on a lot of factors, but depending on how long you cook it and how far you take it, you get a variety of textures in the meat. So up to you. Taste it, see what you like. If you want it to get if you taste it and you want it to get more tender, let it keep cooking. And that's about it. All right, this time for real. One more bite. Guys, gals, non-binary pals, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.